As a tech agent, we don't physically work the investigative end of the cases. The organized crime squad would contact the U.S. Attorney's Office. They would say they had reason to believe that there were discussions of criminal activity occurring in a certain location. The attorney would get a court order to make these surreptitious entries. They would tell us the locations, where it was, what we needed to do. The ultimate goal is to successfully put microphones in and then hopefully be able to record conversations that are criminal in nature.
Welcome to episode 391 of FBI Case File Review with Gerry Williams. I'm a retired agent on a mission to show you who the FBI is and what the FBI does through my books, my blog, and my podcast case reviews with former colleagues. Today, we get to speak to retired agent Gerry Bianke, who served in the FBI for 36 years, 8 as a support employee and 28 as a special agent. In this episode, Gerry reviews several investigations. He worked as a technically trained agent in the Philadelphia division, where he and his technical operations squad, or tech squad, surreptitiously entered into a mob attorney's law office, Philly mob boss John Stanfa's luncheonette, Philly mob boss Ralph Natale's penthouse apartment, and the former Garden State racetrack to install court-authorized electronic surveillance recording devices. You know, wiretaps, hidden cameras, and bugs. Gerry appears in the Netflix documentary Mob War: Philadelphia versus the Mafia, a 3-part series where he talks about how the tech squad contributed to the successful prosecution in many organized crime cases. Gerry also shares on this podcast true stories where he and his tech agents installed cameras and bugs in a judge's chambers in Philadelphia City Hall, in the DRPA Walt Whitman Bridge Toll Collections Counting Room, and a prison chapel at the Lewisburg Penitentiary, a case in which I played an undercover cameo role. Shortly after his appointment as a special agent, Gerry was assigned to the Philadelphia office. In his first year, he worked general criminal investigations before shifting his focus to white-collar crime for the first 7 years, during which he was assigned as the white-collar crime coordinator, while also assisting the field office's only technically trained agent with electronic surveillance matters. Gerry was subsequently selected to attend technical training school at Quantico and began working full-time as a tech agent on the newly formed Technical Operations Squad. Later in his career, Gerry was promoted to lead the team of agents responsible for providing technical assistance across all phases of FBI investigations, covering the eastern half of Pennsylvania and 3 counties in southern New Jersey. Under his supervision, the squad supported organized crime, drug enforcement, white-collar crime, foreign counterintelligence, terrorism, and other investigative efforts, delivering electronic and technical solutions that enhanced case development and prosecution. He continued to serve on and supervise the tech squad until his retirement from the FBI. Now, before we get to the case review, I want to remind you that I'm always looking for retired and former FBI agents to come on FBI Case File Review to take us through an adjudicated case from predication to sentencing. So hit me up on LinkedIn or email me at jerrywilliamsauthor@gmail.com about the investigation you want to review, or to send me guest referrals. Now, sometimes I get suggestions about cases you want me to review, but even with my awesome investigative skills, it's difficult to find the identity and to locate the actual case agent. I do my best, but keep that in mind. And Matt, I'm still working on your request. In your podcast app's description of this episode, you'll find a link to where you can join my reader team, all about crime fiction, so you can keep up with the FBI and books, TV, and movies. And there's also a link where you can buy me a cup of coffee. Thanks for your support. Now here's the show. I want to welcome my guest, retired agent, Gerry Bianke. Hey, Gerry, how are you?
Hi, Gerry. Nice to hear from you.
This is so great because I was watching the three-part Netflix series, Mob War, Philadelphia versus the Mafia, because I knew there were going to be a lot of people from the Philadelphia division that I used to work with who would be on the show. And I was so excited when you popped up. You did a great job. I should call you superstar.
Thank you.
There's a number of people that I'm going to be in touch with, but one of the first people I thought, oh, I got to get him on FBI case file review. And that was you, because it was really fascinating to hear you talk about installing electronic surveillance devices in all of those mob cases from the 1990s, basically.
Yes, they were all in the 90s.
So I thought, well, let me reach out to him and see if I can get him to come on the show, not just to talk about those, but cases that involve drug investigations that occurred in Camden, at the Lewisburg Penitentiary, installations that you made at City Hall, at some of the big bridges that cross between New Jersey and Pennsylvania. There were so many cases that you and your team worked on. I thought, well, let's just do a whole episode reviewing some of the cases that you worked on as a technical agent. So, how does that sound?
Sounds great.
Okay. Before we start on our first case, because we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what you did with organized crime cases in Philadelphia and the Philly mob. Before we start, could you tell us a little bit more about a tech agent, what they do, what kind of experience they bring, what kind of training they have?
Sure, Gerry. When you're selected to go to tech school, initially when I was going in, I think I went through tech school in 1981. And it was a 6-week school. And, it was an intensive school where they taught you all different aspects of the technical program. Obviously, in the 6 weeks, you weren't going to learn everything. And then you would go back to your office and you'd be assigned to the tech squad. And then you'd pretty much do on-the-job training. So you would be assigned with some of the existing tech agents, going out with them. And throughout the years, you were always going back to Quantico to follow up on additional tech schools, new devices that came out, new technologies that came out. So we were always learning. And as things evolved over the years, it went from an analog world until my very end, when I retired in 2002, it started to go into more of the digital world. Back then, when you put a camera in, cameras were the size of a shoebox. And when I was leaving, they were the size of maybe a quarter. So it was really interesting.
The thing is, the first question I would ask is, what type of electronic or engineering background did you have? But knowing what I know about tech agents, so many of them had carpentry skills. And then, of course, you're basically burglars in a sense, because you had to break into buildings and cars. So there's so many skills involved. So what was your...
It's funny because the tech squad, it wasn't really a squad. It was only like 2 guys in the office. I don't remember if you remember Joe McQuillan, and he was the tech advisor at the time, and he was getting overwhelmed. So he put out a request for each squad to devote one agent to kind of learn some of the basic things like wiring somebody up, body wires and transmitters and things like that, to take some of the burden off of him. So I volunteered for my squad. And over the couple of years I did that in helping him, I started to learn more and more about the tech program. I didn't necessarily have any engineering or telephone or technical skills, but I had a big interest in it. And I think after a while, Joe saw that. And when he had an opening for additional tech agents, he asked me if I wanted to come on full time and would I be interested in going to tech school. And that's how I got into it. But some of the guys were really, as you said, leading up to this, some of the guys were really, really great, like with carpentry. And, back then we would make our own devices to hide cameras in and things like that. And some of the guys were really good at that.
And later it did become a full squad.
Back in the early 90s, it went from just a group assigned to one of the other supervisors, where they made Joe McQuillan the supervisor. And then we actually became a squad. By that time, we had about 6 or 7 tech agents assigned. Of course, the responsibilities grew exponentially, over the years. And they just made it a squad. Joe became the first Philadelphia tech supervisor.
Yeah, I know myself as a white collar crime agent utilized the services of the tech squad many, many times. And you had that little room where when you did consensual tapes and consensual recordings, you could go and make your duplicates. And so I remember spending lots of time up there working on my own cases. And it was nice to have that resource, not just the technical resources and the equipment, but the expertise being able to talk to a tech agent and find the best way of capturing that electronic surveillance evidence that we needed for our cases.
Yeah, what was nice was people like you who took an interest in it. We would teach you how to use the recording devices. If you had an informant or a witness or somebody you needed to wire up, after a while, you guys got so good at it yourselves that you took that off of our plate. And I remember you specifically coming up, and all you wanted is some new tapes and batteries because you had a recorder that you were going to strap onto somebody to try to get a recording.
Yeah, and I was old school. I mean, I started out with the Nagras, with the with the reels, and then
And they were pretty big too.
yeah, absolutely. And then just before I retired, we got more and more into the digital, which to tell you the truth made me nervous because with the Nagra, you could feel it. You knew it was working. You could feel it moving. And when it became to digital, sometimes you weren't sure. Is this working?
You know what was funny too? When you had the Nagras and you had those little reel-to-reel tapes and you brought them into court, you could see them. But now you had these, they call them F-birds, and I forget what else they called them back then, but they were hidden in maybe pagers were a pretty popular thing at the time. But you didn't actually have a tape. You had to take the information from that device and download it. And I remember in the beginning, there was a little bit of nervousness on the part of the prosecutors when they presented that type of evidence in court as how it was going to fly. Because now you didn't have a physical tape you looked at. Now you had a tape that you made from a recording that wasn't using tape. It's kind of funny.
Yeah, and I have to say, as a podcaster now who has been editing my work, my recordings for almost 10 years now, I'm very skilled at moving things around, taking out noises, removing sounds. And so I take it there's some way of being able to preserve and to certify that the digital recordings that are being presented have not been tampered with.
Yeah, I remember in the beginning, the first couple of cases, if I remember right, they would actually, if they were going to court, they would actually bring up an expert from Quantico who could testify to the validity of these devices and the recordings. So that's the way it started out. I don't recall how it wound up 30 years later. I don't know. I don't know what they do today.
Yeah, especially with AI and all these deepfakes, which I utilize again in creating artwork and little videos for my podcast. I just can't imagine, what needs to be done in court to authenticate the recordings and the photos and the videos that are being presented as evidence. So that's a whole new topic that we'll have to have somebody who's working on a tech squad more recently talk about. But we're going to go old school and talk about some of those great old cases.
Yeah. Go back to the analog world. Okay.
Because it's pretty cool. I mean, this is institutional knowledge that, the young agents and the young police officers who are listening don't even know what you had to go through. And so it'll be kind of fun to let them know what you had to go through.
I remember when these newer agents would come up and we would show them the Nagra, and you remember the size of it, it was maybe what? Maybe 8 inches long and 4 or 5 inches wide. And they said, where am I going to hide this thing? So you'd have to come up with a creative way to hide that type of device on their body where it wouldn't be found. That was always a challenge, but we did it and they got it done.
All right. I will make sure that I have a photo because I do have an old photo of a Nagra that I will put in the show notes for this episode. And that brings up something else before we start talking about some of the individual cases that you worked on. These cases are from the 90s. And although I will search and see what I can find as far as news articles, we may not be able to talk directly about individuals that were involved, the subjects, and in most cases, we won't even be able to talk about how the case was resolved unless I bring out my expert investigative skills and I'm able to find something online. But otherwise, we're going to do the best that we can because these are old cases.
And I remember, one of our first discussions, I went back and listened to some of your earlier podcasts, and you actually had John Terry, who was one of the organized crime agents, talking about a lot of the mob wars stuff. So you might want to reference so they can hear about those cases and how they were ultimately resolved.
All right, so that's a good segue. So we're going to go right into some of the work that you did on these Philly mob cases, some of the stuff that you've talked about in that Netflix documentary that I mentioned, but there are some things that you didn't mention. So I'm excited. Where do you want to start?
You know what was funny? When I did the Mob Wars interview, the company was located in England, and they came to Philadelphia, and I was interviewed with them for about 10 hours. I think I wound up with about 5 minutes worth of airtime. So I said a lot more on the actual Mob Wars documentary. But that was one of the bigger cases that we ever worked. I would say for the Mob Wars, there were at least 5 surreptitious entries, different locations where we had to use our, as you said earlier, our burglar skills to break into places during the night to install different electronic devices.
All right, let's start from the very beginning. How does someone from the organized crime squad obtain your services?
That's a good question. So obviously, the as a tech agent, we don't physically work the investigative end of the cases. We rely on the case agents. So in this case, the organized crime squad developed information to say that there was some illegal activity being discussed in certain places. They would then gather that information and they would contact the U.S. Attorney's Office. In the mob wars cases and organized crime cases, they used the strike force, which was an arm of the United States Attorney's Office. So they would then go to the attorneys, attorney would get assigned, and they would discuss the cases, and they would say they had reason to believe that there were discussions of criminal activity occurring in a certain location. Once they presented that information to the attorneys, the attorney would decide, yes, we have enough information to write an affidavit to try to get a court order to make these surreptitious entries. And that took quite a bit of work on the part of the case agents to get that information, convince the attorneys that they had enough information to believe that these ongoing conversations were discussing criminal activity. So once the case agents and the attorneys got together to discuss that and decided, yeah, this looks like it's going to work, we're going to be able to get a court order, they would notify the tech squad, tell us the location that they were interested in, and we could start doing some preliminary work trying to get an idea of the layout of the location, where it was, what we needed to do. We would then engage the surveillance squad to start surveilling the location, so we could start getting a feel for the comings and goings. What time did they open? What time did they close? Did anybody stay late into the night? Things like that we would need to know during the night of a surreptitious entry.
You don't think about all the players that are involved in something like that, but you certainly don't want to be inside and have no one telling you, you need to look out, guy.
Exactly. It's like separate teams. You have the prosecutors, you have the case agents, you have the surveillance agents, you have the tech agents, everybody working together to try to get to the ultimate goal is to successfully put microphones in and then hopefully be able to record conversations that are criminal in nature.
So when it comes to the Philly mob, what was the first installation that you did?
The first installation we did, and this was a tricky one, it was into the office. There was an attorney that represented a lot of the mob guys. His name was Salavina. He had an office on the second floor in Camden. The tricky part was, because of the attorney-client privilege, I don't know that there were ever any particular surreptitious entries made into lawyers' offices to record conversations. But the prosecutor listened to the information that was given to him by the case agents and ultimately agreed that there were criminal conversations out of attorney-client privilege that we needed to record. So that's how it all started. So Salavina was the attorney. So the initial entry we did was we went in, and I forgot one group that is very instrumental in helping us here. There's a specialized technical group that we engage out of Quantico. We call them the lock and alarm guys. And these guys are so talented. They can get through a a lock like a hot knife through butter, I tell you. So you have the lock guys, and then once you got in, we knew there was an alarm in there. You have another group of guys that would defeat the alarm so that it wouldn't call out or set off a siren. So that was another important group. Before we did that, we would do all sorts of preliminary work. We would go out there in different capacities during the day, go in the basement, check out wiring. We would locate someplace close by that we could do the monitoring from. So once you install these microphones or cameras, you had to have what we call a plant where the agents that would monitor these microphones and CCTV cameras could sit there and monitor and listen to the recordings. So that all would take place weeks before we would actually do the entry. So once we got the go-ahead, the court order was signed, they told us, and I recall there were plenty of attorneys in that office. It wasn't only the one attorney, Sal. There were several attorneys, so there were multiple offices, but they only gave us the authority to put a microphone into it was like a conference room. So prior to putting the microphone in the conference room, we had one of the team of tech agents went out and installed a camera that would look at the front door of the building. So I believe we put a camera on a pole where you can monitor who was going into the office so you knew who was in there when the conversation started. We made entry into the office successfully, and we went into the conference room, found a space where we felt we would pick up good conversations, installed the microphone. However, on that first entry, something weird happened. When the guys went in, we went in, and there might have been between the lock and alarm guys and the tech guys, we always brought a surveillance guy in with us so he can monitor what was going out on the street. So I remember I was in the basement with 2 or 3 other guys, and all of a sudden we got word that somebody entered the building, and that was kind of strange. So we didn't expect anybody to come in. We later found out that it was time of year where there was going to be an election for a new sheriff of Camden County, and they were using the first floor of that building as kind of a campaign headquarters. Well, it turned out the guy that came in was a deputy sheriff, and he didn't know we were in there. And it was kind of a pucker time for us because obviously he's armed, we're armed. We don't want to get into a situation where, number one, we get exposed, or number two, something really bad happens. So for some reason, the guy came in, he went into the office, he picked up some placards and things for the election, and he left.
What time was this?
This was probably 2:00 in the morning. Yeah, we pretty much almost exclusively surreptitious entries were done after midnight. So we were pretty confident nobody was in there at that time. But this guy showing up was an anomaly for us. Thank goodness we were lucky that night that he didn't pursue it any further. We hunkered down in the basement. The guys upstairs, they stopped what they were doing. And the guy stayed in the office for maybe 10 or 15 minutes and he left and he drove away. We never heard anything more from that. So now you have guys upstairs installing microphones, and they're working with other guys in the basement trying to get the microphones with wiring from the second floor down to the basement so that we can make egress to go out of the building down the street to a plant that was set up. So that took quite a bit of time to get all that done.
And this would have been all done with hard wire?
This was a hardwired microphone. It was not RF or anything like that. And hardwired microphones are always the best. Number one, you get the best audio quality. Number two, they're much harder to detect than microphones that transmit through the air. So we were able to accomplish that night. At one point, I think they were worried that the offices were bugged. So he hired someone who did a sweep of his offices. Well, we found out that the office was going to get swept. So that means that it's called TSCM, Technical Surveillance Countermeasures Sweep, where someone they hire comes in with equipment, they try to detect any electronic devices that might be hidden in that building. So we found out that he was going to have somebody show up at a certain day, a certain time. So we instructed the...
And wait a minute, how did you find out? Was that something that you captured during your audio surveillance?
The agents that were monitoring the microphones found that out, and then they relayed that to us. Well, what do we do? So we said, well, the first thing you do is you shut off the power to the microphone. So they're much harder to detect if there's no power going. So through the camera, they were able to pick up the guy showing up with his suitcase full of gadgets. And he went in, he was in there for a couple of hours, came out, and he said they were clean. So that was another feather in our cap that our devices were hidden well enough that they weren't able to find those devices.
And I know the tech squad, you don't monitor the equipment and the devices installed, but this just gives you an example of how important it is for real-time monitoring. I mean, sometimes you hear about cases where they miss important information, even threats being made.
Basically, you're familiar with the rules. The rules are as long as they're talking about criminal information, they can listen. But if they start talking about their families or other things, they have to minimize those conversations. So they have to shut down the microphones for a minute or two. Then they can go back and see if the conversation has changed. So throughout the conversations that they record, it's going to shut off at times and then turn back on. And like you said, there could be at the time where they will miss an important piece of information because of the minimizations.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
And if you remember watching Mob Wars, for the first few weeks, they didn't really get any incriminating conversations going on. And then finally they got something. And then it was determined that the conference room was not the only room that they were discussing criminal activity. So we were tasked to go back to a second surreptitious entry weeks later to install. And if I remember right, we probably hit about 8 different offices in that building where we installed different microphones in all those offices. And from what I recall, again, I didn't work the case or monitor the conversations, but I know the case agents were very happy. They started to get incriminating conversations that they were able to ultimately use in court cases against these subjects.
Yeah, and I should be able to find some type of news articles about that because, as you mentioned, this was pretty significant, installing recording devices in an attorney's office. But to do so, the case agents and the prosecutors would have been made to provide detailed information to the court about why they believe are, providing proof that conversations about illegal activity were taking place in these different offices.
Absolutely. And there was no attorney-client privilege to these conversations. And eventually these tapes were used in court and were a big part of successfully prosecuting a number of these organized crime individuals.
All right. So as we mentioned, and I've used the word burglarer because you're breaking in. You're doing it sanctioned by the court, but you still are breaking in. You've got to tell me, breaking into a building, 2:00 in the morning in Camden, New Jersey, which is covered by the Philadelphia division, in case people are listening aren't aware of that, has to give you that, pucker factor.
Yeah, you think about it the night you're going out and you say you hope that it's going to be successful. And you do have a little bit of anxiety, a little anxiousness as you go in. Once you get in, though, Gerry, I will tell you, a calm comes over you because now you're just focused on one thing and one thing only, is getting this work done. And like I mentioned earlier in the conversation, we don't monitor what's going on out on the street. We always bring a surveillance agent and a radio technician in with us so they can monitor that and they can hear what's going on. And the only time we have to worry is when the surveillance agent would tell us, hey guys, something's happening. You have to stop what you're doing right now. And that happened when that deputy sheriff came in for about a 10 or 15 minute period. But we just focus on the work. And to be honest with you, Gerry, at that point in time, it's just like working any other day. You just don't think about it. You just go about your business and get the work done.
Wow. All right. So tell us about another one of the installations that you made for the organized crime squad.
Yes, this was all part of the same case. And at the time, they called that documentary Mob Wars because mob guys were killing each other and shooting each other and all sorts of stuff. The organized crime squad then determined that there was a luncheonette in South Philadelphia, one of the mob bosses owned, and there were conversations going on in there. So that was the next surreptitious entry we made during the late night hour or late night, early morning hours, where, again, we brought up the lock and alarm guys. We made a successful entry into the luncheonette. We placed microphones into the luncheonette. Prior to that, we had also put a camera on the outside so that we can monitor the comings and goings of the luncheonette. And of course, the surveillance squad would be utilized for the weeks prior to see what time they closed, what time they opened, so we would know what our window of opportunity was. So in this case, we made entry into the luncheonette, successful, placed the microphone. But about 2 weeks later, we found out the microphone wasn't working properly. And again, this was another hardwired mic that we were able to utilize back to a plant where the agents that were monitoring it could watch the video of who was coming and going and listen to the audio going on. But there was a problem with the microphone. So 2 weeks later, we had to go back in again. And it's funny, we went back in, and when the lock and alarm guys leave us, they usually make a key for us to get in. They leave a key for us, and they tell us how to defeat the alarm. When we went back in 2 weeks later, for some reason, the key didn't work. Now, I don't know whether they changed the lock or there was a problem with the lock. So we were scratching our heads, and one of the guys saw a window, and he pushed on the window, and the window was open. It was not locked. So one of the tech agents, Dennis Murray, and I climbed in through the window, replaced the microphone, and got out. So again, now everything was working fine. And normally what we did after the case was over, we would all get together, we would meet somewhere, and then you'd go home, try to get a few hours of sleep. Well, that night, went home, probably got home about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock in the morning. Slept for a few hours. I woke up, turned the TV on, my house, and all of a sudden, I'm looking at the luncheonette I had just come out of. Well, apparently, within an hour or two after we had made that second entry, a car pulled up in front of the luncheonette, and 3 guys got out, ran in the luncheonette, and shot one of the mob guys who was in the luncheonette. Unfortunately, it was dark at the time. They could see the people go in. You could hear the shots going off. It was the first time a mob hit was recorded on audio. And that was kind of interesting, but it was kind of a weird feeling when I woke up that morning and I saw where we had just come out of. Luckily, because of the intelligence we had, we were out of there at least an hour before that happened.
That's absolutely amazing. So did you install microphones and videos or?
No, the video we had was on the outside, so you could see who was going in and out of the luncheonette, but there were microphones inside to record the audio. So you didn't actually see the person shooting, but you could see 3 people run in, 3 people run out, and you can hear the guns going off.
Now, you were installing that microphone because you knew that conversations about illegal organized crime activities were occurring, but at no time did you think they were going to actually try to do a mob hit.
No, that wasn't the plan, but that's what happened. You never know what's going to happen on these things. So from there, they got some good recordings, which they were able to use later on in the trials that happened later on in the case. So from there, we went to a third surreptitious entry, and this was interesting. A guy by the name of Ralph Natale became one of the co-bosses of the Philadelphia mob, and he lived in a penthouse apartment over in New Jersey, over on Cooper River. So they decided that there was some information. They had gotten information that conversations were occurring in his penthouse apartment. So the next surreptitious entry was to enter into his apartment, which was on the top floor of about a 15-story apartment building. So again, surveillance starts surveilling the location. We contact the lock and alarm guys, bring them up, and then we get the team of agents in the basement and another team to go into the apartment, and we were successful. The funny thing was we knew there was nobody in the apartment. I guess this was through intelligence, through the case agents and informants, that the owner of the apartment or the mob boss was in Atlantic City that night, and he was supposed to stay overnight in Atlantic City. So we knew there was nobody in the apartment. So as soon as we opened the door, nobody told us there was a cat in the apartment. So all of a sudden, this cat makes a beeline for the door. Luckily, one of the agents was able to grab him before he got out. That would have been a mess if we had to chase that cat around the building. But luckily, we got the cat, got him in there, and then we were able to successfully put microphones into the apartment.
Now, you're doing a surveillance and having somebody make sure that Ralph Natale is in Atlantic City. You have somebody outside making sure people are not watching you come and go. But how do you account for neighbors, nosy neighbors?
Yeah, that was strange because there were other apartments in that building. But again, this was probably at 1 o'clock in the morning. We were very quiet and we came up with some type of a scenario if somebody happened to open their door. But luckily, nobody did. The interesting thing here was we were told that Ralph was supposed to be in Atlantic City overnight. But then all of a sudden, the surveillance agent with us said he's leaving Atlantic City and he's heading back home. Well, Atlantic City to Pennsauken, New Jersey, is about an hour and 15-minute drive. So now, we had things kind of torn apart where we were installing microphones in different rooms. So we now had to scramble to finish up the work, tidy up, clean up, get everything cleaned up and get out of there in a lot shorter time than we had anticipated. So we were able to get that done and successfully have conversations that the case agents were able to ultimately monitor and later use in court.
Yeah, I'm thinking about all the complications because nowadays, if you were to do something like that, you could come in, take, photographs or, take pictures of where everything is so that to make sure to put it back exactly where it is. But back in the 90s, that wasn't possible. I mean, we were still processing film at that time. It wasn't something that you could do instantly.
Yeah, we did have a Polaroid camera, so you could take a couple of shots. Because, like you said, you're absolutely right. We want to make sure that every chair is in the same spot. And I remember he had a very plush carpet in his living room, and we had to make sure that we smoothed out the carpet before we left, so you didn't see footprints in the carpeting. So yeah, it was a lot to think about. But again, it was executed, and again, that was the third surreptitious entry on this case, the same case. From there, we move. We then get told, and those organized crime guys were busy guys. They were keeping us really busy. They then told us that at the time, there was a racetrack in Cherry Hill, New Jersey. It was called the Garden State Racetrack. It's no longer there. Eventually, it's been taken down. But at the time, it was a pretty active place. And they told us that Ralph and some of his cohorts were having conversations at a bar in the restaurant inside the racetrack. So that was the next entry we had to make. So that one we did again during the night, but they had security people on duty. So we had to work with the security people and had to clue somebody in that we would be coming in under a different guise. We would be coming in as phone men to fix something so we can come in during the night and it wouldn't raise any eyebrows. So we were able to go in, and in that case, we put a camera in and we put microphones around the bar so that we can capture conversations that Ralph was having with his other organized crime cohorts in that bar area.
And now that had to be tricky because you're going to have to, or the case agent is responsible for finding someone that he or she could trust.
That's correct. Yeah, they found someone that they could trust. So they were the ones that we contacted. And when the night that we were going in, and he made sure we were getting in there unnoticed by anybody else. He kept all the other security people off the floor that we were in so that we could do our work and get out. It was successful again. So at that point, we were 4 for 4, Gerry. I'll tell you about one more, and this is interesting. So then they told us they had information that there was an organized crime figure, in this case, had an office in a bakery over in New Jersey. So they wanted microphones placed in his office so they can record him. So we didn't have a lot of intelligence about that bakery, but it was kind of not too far from where I lived. So it was the Deluxe Bakery, and we needed to get some intelligence on it. So one Sunday after church, I said to my wife, and I never told her what I was doing. I just said, "Hey, I hear there's a nice bakery. Why don't we try it out?" So we went to the bakery. She got online, and luckily there was about 10 people in front of her. So I was able to walk around, not only looking at the cakes and things, but I was able to determine what type of a lock they had, what type of alarm keypad they had. And I saw a sign in there. And this was right around the Christmas holidays. I saw a sign that said they would be closed on Christmas Day and New Year's Day. But it was not only a retail bakery, it was also an industrial bakery. So there were people there 24/7 every day, with the exception of Christmas and New Year's. So at that point, we made a decision that we were going to go in on Christmas Eve and install a microphone. So that's what we did. And I remember it was a pretty busy street. So we engaged one of the agents that was in our Camden RA, had a CDL license. So he was able to get an 18-wheeler and pull it up in the parking lot to block the front entrance of that bakery so that we could get in without being noticed. So that's what we did. We were able to get in. And in that case, that was not a hardwired microphone. That was a RF radio frequency microphone. So we had to have a plant close by so we can pick up the conversation.
And why did you decide to do that instead of a hardwire?
For some reason, we couldn't figure a way to get the wires out of that building to another location. So the decision was made to use RF. So we put an RF microphone in on Christmas Eve, probably 2:00 in the morning, got out, successful. But apparently the microphone started giving us some problems right away. So fortunately, we had one other opportunity, and that was New Year's Eve. So New Year's Eve, same scenario. We go back in 2:00 in the morning, place the microphone, and this one worked fine. And it stayed in for however long they were authorized to listen to the microphone. So that was successful. And it's funny, first time my wife found out about what she was a part of that surreptitious surveillance or survey was when I went to do Mob Wars. That's when I told my wife. I never talked about what I did.
Wow. So that's a good question. Did she know what your job entailed? She knew that you were out at all hours of the night.
Oh, sure. When I had to leave Christmas Eve and New Year's Eve, I couldn't tell her I was just going for a walk. Yeah, she knew I was going out to do some kind of work. I never told her what it was, where it was, what type of case it was. But I kind of enjoyed when, again, this happened 25 years ago, and a lot of it became public knowledge, except for the fact of what her part in it. So she's pretty proud that she played a part in our surreptitious entry.
That is funny. Yeah, that is funny.
So later on, I guess, as the 90s drew on and the case agents put the case together with the strike force attorneys, and eventually it went to court, and we would wire up the court for the jury and the judges and the attorneys and the defendants to listen. We'd put headphones and recorders in there, and they would play the recordings. And from what they tell us, it was a major part of them able to convict a bunch of these organized crime guys.
Excellent. And I will put links to John Terry's episode, which was episode 90, where he talked about the Philly mob, Ralph Natale, and Ron Privity. And so a lot of the cases that you were mentioning are going to be covered in his interview. So I'll have links to those news articles. And I'll also have a link to a trailer for the Netflix documentary Mob Wars. All right, so we're going to move from organized crime and talk about some of the installations that you did for drug investigations.
So this was interesting, and I know you were a party to this. Philadelphia covered half the state of Pennsylvania, as far out from Philly all the way out past State College and North Scranton, plus 3 counties in South Jersey. So we got a call from our agents that worked in Williamsport, Pennsylvania, that they had a case involving drugs at the Lewisburg Penitentiary. And that's the one, Gerry, I think you're pretty familiar with.
Yeah, I had a small role, and we'll talk about that after you get into the case a little bit more.
So, as I recall, we were told that some of the inmates were getting visits from their wives and girlfriends who would come in to visit them during visiting hours. And the women would have drug paraphernalia and drugs strapped somehow under their clothing, usually to the inside of their thigh. And they would go and meet in a chapel where they were allowed to meet. And once they got in there was a camera installed in there by the prison, but the bad guys knew, the inmates knew what the cameras were looking at. So we were able to go in and put additional cameras in, secreted cameras that they didn't know were there. So we were able to hide some additional cameras in there so that we were able to see the activity of the inmates meeting with these women and somehow passing the drugs from the women to the inmates. And I think that's where you come in, Gerry. I think you were kind of an observer, were you not?
Yeah, so I was assigned to ride the visitors bus to the visitor center at the Lewisburg Penitentiary with the women that were visiting. It was myself and Tina Johnson, who has since married and doesn't go by Tina Johnson anymore. But Tina and I were playing cameo undercover roles as visitors to the penitentiary. So we were on the bus observing what the women were doing. And after the camera detected these visitors passing drugs to the inmates, then Tina and I were responsible for making that arrest for strip searching. It was the first time I ever did a strip searching the women that had been arrested and confiscating any of the drugs and illegal paraphernalia that they were bringing into the penitentiary. I had almost forgotten about that until we were talking about this case.
Yeah, it was kind of eerie. You can't do a really surreptitious entry into a prison. Obviously, the warden and his people, certain trusted people, knew who we were and what we were doing because people don't ordinarily come and visit during the middle of the night. But it was just eerie. It was an eerie feeling walking around that prison at night times. Just kind of a strange feeling. But again, we got in, we got out, and you did your part. Another successful case on the drug squads.
Yeah, and I tried my best to find articles about that. And again, that was probably I think that might have even still been in the 80s. I'm not quite sure, but
it might have been, if you can find Mike Hudak, he was a Williamsport agent, I think. I don't know if you remember Mike.
Oh, absolutely. I will contact him, and maybe he has, a copy of a news article that he saved from that case, and we'll see. But it certainly was fun to think about it and to remember the small role that I played in that. It was really strange, though, because, and we haven't really talked about it, was why they were able to use this chapel to pass the drugs. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, to be honest with you, I don't know. I'm not sure why. I guess for religious reasons, they were able to use the chapel. They were supposed to go in there and pray, but it became a place where they were able to get drugs passed. Because, when you see on TV, you see these rooms with tables in it where visitors can come in. But the chapel it was a chapel where they can hold a religious ceremony. But I'm not sure why they were allowed to have visitors go in there, but they were. And maybe Mike can help you on.
All right, I'll see what I can find out. But yeah, that was a pretty unique case that most people wouldn't even think about having an FBI camera or microphone installed in a penitentiary, in a prison. But you did it.
Yeah, that was another interesting case. If you want to move on, Gerry, here's the case. Let's get away from drugs for a minute and organized crime. So one of the white-collar crime guys was working a case at the DRPA, Delaware River Port Authority, by the Walt Whitman Bridge. There was a building there. It was kind of a headquarters for all of the bridges that went over from New Jersey to Philadelphia. And there was a money counting room. And back then, and I think, again, that was either the late 80s or 90s. Back then, I think the bridge was only maybe 50 cents or 60 cents. So there used to be a lot of people that threw quarters into the baskets to cross over the bridge. So all these coins at the end of the day for all the different toll booths were brought into this money counting room, and they would run them through a money counter, and that's how they counted the money. And then the other money that was collected by the toll takers, the actual bills, they would be counted in there also. But we were told by the case agent that there was a group of people in there who were siphoning off these coins. There was no real accountability for the coins till they went through the coin counter. So somehow, we had to work through the security people for the Delaware River Port Authority. So I'm sure through the case agent, we had cooperation through the Delaware River Port Authority security people to give us entry during the night to go into the money counting room and install a camera. Interesting, again, that this was not a place where it was easy to have any egress to get hardwired microphones. One of our agents who was really talented, he was very crafty. And by that time, they did have some smaller cameras become available. And we saw there was a battery-operated clock on the wall. So we were able to purchase the same clock. And then he took the clock and he was able to install a camera behind the clock by putting it behind the clock, punching out a little hole in one of the numbers using a small, what we would call pinhole lens, and that's where the camera would be hidden on the wall. Behind the clock, again, since we couldn't get a signal out of there, we also put a transmitter in there. Now we had to engage an undercover agent to go in there, and again, through working through the case agent and security, we were able to get a female agent who was then a new hire into that room, and we outfitted her with a backpack and a transmitter receiver and a small recorder so she can record all of the video that was coming off of that camera that was hidden behind the clock. So once we went in there to install it, we noticed that right next to the coin counting machine were these plastic cups. And they were the kind of cups that they used to use at the casinos when they used to use coins, quarters, and things. So what these people were doing was, when they dumped all these baskets of money from outside, from the toll booths, into the machine, they would take these plastic cups and they'd fill 3 or 4 cups with quarters, so they never got counted through the machine. And they would then go into another room and count the quarters and substitute the quarters for dollar bills. So that's how they were able to siphon off money that never got counted. And it went on for years. We were told it went on for 4 or 5 years. But ultimately, through the video and seeing what they were doing, they were able to get an indictment against, I think, 5 people in there. They convicted 5 of these money counting people of stealing money from the bridge tolls. Now they use mostly Easy Pass.
Yeah.
Yeah, this was the ones, if you remember, Gerry, they used to have like a basket at the toll booth. You could just drive through, throw your quarters in and drive out. And those went into like a box or something. And at the end of the day, they'd bring them in coin counting machine and coin counting room. And that's where they got counted. So there was no real accountability for those coins till they counted them inside the coin counting.
Yeah, nowadays, you're right. We either have Easy Pass, or if you are using cash, which you shouldn't because it takes you that much longer to get across the bridge, and it's only one way.
It's only $5 now to do it.
Yeah. So you get a receipt and there's a camera that's capturing everybody who goes through. So that lack of accountability is not there anymore. They know exactly how much money is being collected each day. So the work that you did had a purpose, and they're not doing it that way anymore.
Yeah, unfortunately, the case agent, I don't remember if you remember John Rabina, he passed away.
Yeah.
So
Who was the agent that played a role as a toll collector counter?
That was Kristen Church, who
Ah,
eventually became a tick agent.
yeah,
She
that's
wasn't
right.
a
She
tick agent
certainly
at the
did.
time,
Yeah,
married
married
to
to
Luke.
Luke.
And I remember they were very skeptical of her, if I remember right, because all of a sudden a new person was coming in there. She would come in with her backpack, and they gave her a little bit of a hard time. But she hung in there, and they never figured out until later on, obviously, when it was exposed in court that she was the person that was in there recording them stealing the money.
Yeah, and that's pretty cool because even if they kept her at a far distance, she didn't need to be anywhere near what they were doing or near the actual camera. She just needed to be close enough for that feed to come into her backpack.
That's correct. That's correct. That's exactly right. Yeah, good.
Pretty cool. Okay. I love that one. That's again something that you don't even think about.
Jerry, we did so many. I remember when we up in Williamsport, there was a group of Soviet GRU, which is the military security for not the KGB, GRU, they're the military spies for the USSR. And they were coming through Williamsport for some reason, and they wanted us to put a camera in a hotel room. So we had to kind of get the room next door. And from the next door, we had to cut out a wall and put a camera in behind the wall. And I remember the wall was pristine, and now all of a sudden there was a little hole. So one of our agents went down to the Home Depot or Lowe's at the time and got wallpaper and wallpapered the wall. I can remember the manager of the hotel. He wanted to see what we did, and he walked in, and of course, none of the rooms had wallpaper. And his mouth opened when he saw the wallpaper. We said, "Don't worry, we'll take the wallpaper down." And the object there was to catch these guys. Apparently, would wear this. Again, I'm not an expert when it comes to this foreign counterintelligence stuff, but I think the devices they wore were called Shrek, and they would use that to transmit information back to the motherland. So they were trying to capture that. I don't know if that was successful, but I thought the installation was interesting where we had to actually wallpaper a wall to hide the camera.
Again, another unique tool and unique way to do your installations. Pretty cool.
You know, at any one time, we would run anywhere from 20 to 100 what we would call pen registers, which is where you would tap into a phone. You weren't allowed to get audio, but you were allowed to capture every phone call in or out, the phone numbers, so you can identify who was calling, who they were calling, and who was calling in. So that was kind of part of some of my daily responsibilities, was to run reports for any number of what we call pen registers. Now, eventually, some of those pen registers turned into Title IIIs, which would allow you to actually turn the audio on from those pen registers so you can monitor the actual conversations. So that was a big part of my responsibilities. So I did that, Jerry. I did that for 20 years. And ultimately, when my supervisor, Joe, retired, I became the supervisor the last 3 or 4 years.
Well, again, and you know, I'm not just saying this because I'm talking to you, but your squad was such an important part of the Philadelphia division. You know, I knew all the people that worked there. I probably worked with all of the people on your squad. They were so responsive and, you know, provided, again, not just the equipment, but the expertise in helping all of us case agents make decisions about the best way to capture that electronic evidence that we were looking for to help us with our cases.
Yeah, that was where we got our satisfaction. Since we didn't actually get the satisfaction of going to court and getting convictions, but we participated, and the success that we had, and the agents like yourself, the appreciation that you showed us was always great for us.
All right, we're going to talk about one more and then prepare for my hard question, which is going to be the things that you failed, the oops, and because there had to be some that things didn't work out the way that you thought they would. But let's do one more and talk about City Hall. Now, of course, there is a big, huge case that I am still trying to get as a case review, and that is when the tech squad went into City Hall and put a bug in the mayor's office, Mayor Street. But that was after your time.
Yeah, that was after my time. But prior to that time, when I was there, we did do one in a judge's chambers. And apparently the judge was accepting bribes from some type of intermediary person when these cases would come before him. This guy would meet with the judge in his chambers and pass him money to give lighter sentences to some of the defendants. We weren't able to get a camera in, but we were able to put a microphone in. I think we put a camera in the hallway outside the chambers, but we couldn't put one inside. But we did put a microphone in there and captured that.
You have to tell me how you did it because we're talking about Philadelphia City Hall, which I take has, in addition to Philadelphia police officers roaming around, but they probably have their own security too.
Yeah, we were able to get some cooperation from the police department who kind of got us in there. But I could recall when we were leaving, there were two deputy sheriffs that walked by. They weren't part of the knowing who we were. But the case agent was actually with us on that one, and he intercepted them and kind of talked to them and told them, swore them to secrecy, I guess is what happened.
You see nothing. Nothing's going on. Now, here's my question. Are you skipping anything? Any stories about how things did not work out well?
Not really. I mean, we would do installations where they just didn't work out. I can recall one we did where we put cameras and microphones into an apartment, and there was supposed to be a mob making ceremony. And we did a lot of work in that apartment, but the meeting never happened. So all that work went down the drain for nothing. But you'd have little glitches where, like I said, there were times we had to go in and replace a microphone or fix a microphone, things like that. But overall, we were pretty successful in what we did. Once we set out to do it, ultimately we accomplished what we started out to do.
And no times that you can think of where you were caught in the act or anything like that?
Well, the closest we came was when that deputy sheriff came in the attorney's building when we were there. That was the closest. I mean, I've heard throughout the Bureau others that may have had that problem, but we never had that problem. Maybe it was good surveillance work, but whatever it was, we were lucky enough never to get caught.
Well, I am not disappointed to hear that. All right, so this has been wonderful. We've learned a lot, but we haven't given any trade secrets away because we're talking about a time many, many years ago. The devices and equipment have all changed, but not necessarily the techniques to get in and out of a particular location.
Yeah, I'm sure that it's probably same today. They have the same resources today in terms of lock and alarm expertise that comes up to help out.
So we are at the point of the episode where I like to learn your origin story, your when and why you joined the FBI. And you actually were an FBI employee before you became a special agent.
In July of 1965, right out of high school. My father worked for the FBI. He was, at the time, there was a position called special employee. It was kind of between a support person and a special agent. And he started in the FBI, believe it or not. And I just looked this up for our meeting today, in 1939. He started in 1939. He had a break of about 3 years when he entered World War II, and he retired in 1973. So he was a first generation Italian, and he spoke Italian. So they used him as a translator quite a bit. I never knew what he did for the FBI. As a kid growing up, I was always curious, but he would never talk about it. So I had to join the FBI just to find out what he did. So I joined in 1965, did various support roles. In the meantime, while working, I went to college at night and got my bachelor's degree, which gave me a qualification that allowed me to become a special agent. I became a special agent in August of 1973. I went to Quantico, and that's where my special agent days began.
And you worked for the first 7 years doing white-collar crime cases?
Yeah, mostly white-collar crime for the first 7. When you first come in, you worked a little general criminal work, but that was at a time when they give you 50 cases. And some of them could be like $200 check cases. They wanted to get away from that. And they switched over from what they used to call quantity quality cases. And then you'd work bigger cases. So I worked white-collar crime for about 7 or 8 years. And ultimately, they decided they wanted to try these positions. They wanted to make an organized crime intelligence coordinator and a white-collar crime intelligence coordinator. So they somehow selected me to do that. I did that for about a year, and then I kind of missed going out working cases. So I went back out into the field. And then ultimately, after about 8 years, I went to tech school. And from 1981 till I retired in 2002, I worked tech work.
Now, once you retired, did you make use of all of that technical experience and skills that you learned outside of the Bureau?
I did. I realized when I was getting ready to retire, I didn't really give it much thought. But I realized right away that I need something to do. My old boss, Joe McQuillan, had a company he formed where he would do installations, companies that wanted to put cameras in or do countermeasure sweeps. So I worked with him for about a year and a half, but the work was piecemeal. And ultimately, I started applying for full-time jobs. And I got hired by a bank in New Jersey. At the time, it was Commerce Bank. It later became TD Bank. And ultimately, I was hired to run their physical security department. And they made me a vice president, in which I was in charge of all the locks and alarms and cameras and IPACs and all the security things that went into a bank. And I did that for 12 years. When I went in, there was only like 3 people in the department. By the time I left, there were 30 people, and it grew exponentially. It was interesting because it was in the analog was just coming into the digital world. The cameras we had were terrible. My first month there were like 10 robberies in Philadelphia, and none of those robberies could you identify the robber from the cameras we had. By the time I left, we had the best camera coverage in all the banks of New Jersey. It was very gratifying. I was able to go out and actually hire a bunch of retired agents. I'd run into a guy or call a guy up that I knew was retired. And I think I hired about 6 guys to work either part-time or full-time in my department. So I was able to successfully use that and did it for 12 years. And it was another satisfying career for me.
All right. Well, we're at the very, very end now. And I like to give my guest the last word. So what would you like to say?
My last word, Gerry. First, I appreciate the opportunity you gave me today. I was a little skeptical when originally contacted to do Mob Wars, but having listened to your podcasts, I realized that people are talking a lot more today than they used to talk. Back then, you weren't allowed to talk about anything, but it was interesting. And your podcasts were so interesting. And when you reached out to me, I was excited to be able to do your podcast.
Is there anything left that you'd like to say? Because at the end of every episode, I like to give my guest the last word.
One other thing, a saying that's attributed to Confucius is choose a job you love and you will never have to work a day in your life. And that's what I did by joining the FBI. And I would get calls at all hours of the day or night or weekend or holiday. And I'd pack up my stuff and I'd whistle out that my wife would get mad at me. She would tell people, he gets a call and he goes whistling out the door. He's happy to go to work. Yeah, I was happy to go to work, and I was fortunate in what I did. I felt like my career with the FBI was successful. I got to work with very talented people, and I have friendships today that will last me a lifetime. So working for the FBI was a dream come true, and it was a very gratifying career.
That's the end of the interview. In your podcast app's description of this episode, there's a link to the show notes at jerrywilliams.com, where you'll find a photo of Gerry Bianke, case-related images, and links to articles about the cases reviewed, as well as a link to the Netflix documentary Mob War, Philadelphia versus the Mafia. There's also a link to FBI Case File Review episode 123 with retired agent J.J. Claver, who also reviews how the FBI uses electronic surveillance and reviews the Fort Dix 6 case. But wait, there's more. There are also links to more episodes about the Philadelphia Organized Crime Squad's investigation of the Philly mob. I hope you enjoyed the interview and that you'll share it with your friends, family, and associates. You can show me just how much you liked it by buying me a coffee. There's a link in your podcast app's description of this episode, or you can visit jerrywilliams.com and tap on the little coffee cup icon in the bottom right-hand corner of my website. Don't forget to follow FBI Case File Review on your favorite podcast app. Now, this podcast is all about true crime, but if you're also interested in crime fiction, once a month via my reader team email, I keep you up to date on the FBI and books, TV, and movies. When you join my reader team, you get access to my FBI reading resource, a colorful list of more than 100 books about the FBI written by FBI agents who have been guests on this podcast. There's nonfiction, crime fiction, true crime, and memoirs. You'll also get my FBI reality checklist, where I debunk 20 cliches about the FBI and receive news about what I'm up to and about my FBI nonfiction and crime fiction books. I want to thank you for listening to the very end. I hope you come back for another episode of FBI Case File Review with Gerry Williams. Thank you.